Governments across Europe are collapsing in the polls. And the culprit isn't just global chaos, it's the price of your groceries and the rules blocking your housing.
Yeah, it really is a total crisis of confidence right now.
It really is. I mean, if you look at the political map today, you are seeing this continent-wide meltdown playing out in real time. Welcome to today's deep dive, everyone. We have a massive stack of sources to get through today.
We really do. We've got brand new YouGov and Gallup polls, a really detailed economic policy report from Epicenter, and some intense on-the-ground reporting from Germany.
Right, and what all this data reveals is a historic rejection of the status quo. I mean,
Right.
people are just angry, and that anger is actively rewriting the political map. In the UK, you have a brand new government in absolute free fall. In France, a huge chunk of the population literally wants to pack their bags and leave the country.
Which is just staggering to think about.
Right. But to understand why this is happening, our mission today is to look past the usual political theater. We are going to examine the hidden regulatory machinery that is, quietly making your everyday life completely unaffordable.
Exactly. And the symptoms of this frustration are incredibly stark when you look at the immediate polling. I mean, let's start with the UK. The Labour government is seeing a collapse that is almost mathematically unprecedented for a new administration.
It's like a honeymoon that ended in a divorce before the bags were even unpacked.
That is exactly what it is. Because as of April 2026, their net approval rating sits at -53.
Wait, -53 already?
Yeah, -53. Only 15% of Britons actually approve of their record right now. But the number that really signals a total systemic breakdown is that 48% of the people who voted for Labour just in 2024, they now disapprove of them.
Wow, almost half of their own voters jumped ship that fast.
Yep. Prime Minister Keir Starmer has hit a 22% approval rating.
I mean, those numbers just paint a picture of a public that feels completely betrayed. And the YouGov polling shows us exactly what's driving it. People are citing the economy that's at 54% and immigration at 51% as their absolute top priorities.
Right, the core issues.
Yeah, and around 3/4 of Britons say the government is handling those specific issues badly. It's just a fundamental failure to deliver on the basic mechanics of running a country.
And, France tells a very similar story of institutional collapse, but honestly with even deeper structural warning signs. The Gallup data shows French trust in their national government has plummeted 13 points. It's down to just 29%.
That is bleak.
It really is.
Yeah.
President Emmanuel Macron's approval is sinking at 28%, which is a massive drop from his 61% high back in 2017.
Well, the statistic that actually forced me to read the paragraph twice was the flight risk.
Oh yeah, that one is wild.
27% of French adults now state they want to leave the country permanently.
Permanently, just walk away.
Right. That rate more than doubled from last year. Over a quarter of an entire nation wants to walk away from their own country.
And when you cross-reference that flight risk with the broader economic mood, the root of all this despair becomes really clear. 68% of the French public now believe government corruption is widespread.
Which just kills any trust in the system.
Exactly. And 67% say their local economy is actively getting worse. A functioning democracy relies on a baseline level of trust that the system actually works for the public. And that trust is largely gone.
Okay, I hear you on the polling, but I want to push back a little here. I want to play devil's advocate.
Sure, go for it.
Isn't it a bit much to blame local governments for all of this? I mean, we are barely out of a massive global pandemic that shattered supply chains. We have a massive land war in Ukraine that scrambled global energy and food markets. So isn't this inflation just a massive hangover from global chaos? How is this the government's fault?
Well, those global shocks are undeniably real, and they definitely ignited the initial inflation. But the Epicenter report makes a really compelling case that state actions are locking those high prices in permanently.
What do you mean by locking them in?
It comes down to structural costs. When a global shock hits, sure, prices spike. But when a government layers burdensome regulations and incredibly high taxation on top of an already strained supply chain, they bake those higher costs right into the foundation of the economy.
So they turn a temporary spike into a permanent floor for prices.
Exactly. For housing, energy, everyday goods, the state guarantees things stay expensive.
Okay, let's test that theory by looking at the taxation data from the sources, because the consumption taxes in France are staggering. The real value added tax, the VAT, on fuel hits 39%.
Yep.
And for cigarettes, it's pushed all the way up to 107%.
Right, and those are heavy consumption taxes, which governments often frame as, sin taxes or environmental levies. They artificially inflate the final price tag you see at the register. But the real hidden anchor on the economy is production taxes.
Production taxes. Explain the mechanics of that for a second. How does a tax on a corporate entity translate to the economic frustration of just an everyday worker?
Well, think of a business's revenue like a pie. If the government takes a larger slice of that pie before profits are even calculated, the business just has less money available for everything else.
Right, including wages.
Exactly. The Epicenter report quantifies this perfectly in France. Those production taxes cost the average French employee about 900 euros a year in suppressed wages.
Wait, 900 euros?
Yep. The employer simply cannot pay the worker that money because the state has already swept it up. It functions as this massive, invisible pay cut.
Man, and Greece provides a brutal case study of how this backfires on the state itself. They implemented aggressive indirect taxes, including this absurd luxury tax aimed at high-end goods.
To extract more revenue from the wealthy.
Right, that was the goal. But it completely decimated their domestic jewelry industry. The tax made importing raw materials so expensive that local jewelers couldn't compete at all. Businesses either shut down or moved.
Wow.
Yeah, so the state raised barely any new revenue, but they destroyed thousands of domestic jobs in the process.
And, housing operates on the exact same mechanical logic. I mean, housing is the single largest expense for most citizens. And government attempts to fix the housing market usually trigger the exact shortages that drive prices up.
Right. Berlin's experiment with rent control is the clearest example of this.
It really is.
Because on paper, a rent cap sounds like the ultimate pro-consumer policy. The city government literally stepped in and said, you cannot charge more than this specific amount for an apartment.
But the result was a 60% collapse in the supply of available rental housing.
See, that is wild to me. If rent is capped, shouldn't it be easier for renters to afford the apartments that do exist?
Well, it is easier for the people who already hold a lease. But you have to look at the behavior of the builders and the property owners. If you cap the return on investment for an apartment building below the market rate, developers just take their capital and build somewhere else. Or they build commercial real estate instead.
So the builders just leave.
Yeah, and current owners stop putting vacant units on the market because the capped rent doesn't even cover their maintenance costs. The supply just freezes.
So if you are a young person looking for your first apartment, you spend 6 months applying for units that effectively do not exist.
Exactly, because nobody's building new ones.
And the bureaucracy itself acts as a massive tax on construction, too. Look at the Czech Republic. The strict zoning regulations and just the sheer difficulty of securing a construction permit mean that housing prices there grew more than twice as fast as the EU average.
Twice as fast, just from red tape.
Yeah. The paperwork alone requires a small Czech business to dedicate 6 weeks of labor every single year just to comply with state rules. That is 6 weeks of paying an employee to fill out government forms. And obviously that cost gets added directly to the price of the house they were building.
And that regulatory premium applies heavily to energy as well. Germany made this deliberate, politically mandated decision to phase out nuclear and coal energy, and simultaneously, they implemented a strict ban on fracking.
Right.
So by state mandate, they legally removed their own access to cheap, reliable domestic energy.
And the Epicenter report specifically models that if Germany had just retained its existing nuclear power plants, electricity prices could have dropped by up to 4%.
But instead, they forced a reliance on imports and heavily subsidized renewables.
And then they tax the resulting high prices. Energy and electricity taxes in Germany generate over 44 billion euros.
That's unbelievable.
You pay the inflated price for the imported energy, and then you pay a massive premium to the government for the privilege of using it.
And the culmination of all these state interventions creates a devastating cycle for lower-income households, because people with less money spend a much larger percentage of their income on these heavily regulated necessities.
Right, heating, fuel, rent, those aren't optional.
No, they aren't. So when the state inflates the cost of those baselines, it traps people. Taxes and red tape just eat their purchasing power month after month.
Well, when you squeeze people economically from all sides like that, eventually they push back physically. And we are seeing a massive grassroots reaction to these top-down mandates starting out in the fields.
Yeah, the farmers.
According to the FEPS Europe report, farmer protests have erupted across multiple borders, and they are all fighting different heads of the same regulatory hydra.
Yeah, in the Netherlands, the state is enforcing these strict EU nitrate regulations that demand massive reductions in nitrogen emissions. For a Dutch farmer, that means drastically shrinking their herds,
Hmm.
which, just destroys the fundamental math of their livelihood.
Right. And in Germany, agricultural workers are fighting in the government over sudden reductions in diesel tax breaks. That makes running their tractors instantly more expensive.
And in Poland, they are blockading roads over cheap Ukrainian grain imports.
And if you look at the mechanism here, the farmers are just trapped in a vice. The government enforces intense environmental regulations that make domestic farming incredibly expensive. But then the same government allows cheap agricultural imports from countries that don't have to follow those expensive rules.
Yeah, it's completely unworkable.
It's like forcing your own farmers to run a race with ankle weights while the competition gets to ride a bicycle.
The math simply does not work for them. But, this feeling of being squeezed by state priorities isn't isolated to agriculture. There is a massive demographic shift happening among the youth right now. The Guardian recently detailed a sprawling movement among German students. Over 50,000 pupils have organized strikes.
And they aren't striking over, like, climate change or education funding. They are striking against Chancellor Friedrich Merz's rearmament policy.
Yes, the Military Service Modernization Act.
Right. Germany plans to spend 779 billion euros on defense by the end of the decade. So the state is now sending mandatory questionnaires to all 18-year-olds to assess their willingness for military service, and they are implementing mandatory medical tests.
And the organizers of these school strikes are openly stating they refuse to be turned into cannon fodder. They are doing the economic math of their own futures.
Yeah.
They see a government capable of finding nearly 800 billion euros for tanks and military infrastructure, while their own day-to-day lives are getting demonstrably harder.
It is the ultimate generational disconnect. These young people are looking at crumbling school infrastructure, housing prices that are mathematically impossible for them to afford on a starting salary, and a cost of living that eats every euro they earn. And the state's response is to demand their physical readiness for military service.
And this disconnect drives the deep youth disillusionment measured in the BCSDN data. Millennials and Gen Z are just checking out of the mainstream political process. In 2024, only 36% of 15 to 24-year-olds bothered to vote. There's a stark generational divide in priorities here. Young people overwhelmingly cite the cost of living, housing, and jobs as their primary concerns, while older voting blocs focus heavily on national security.
So you have angry farmers blocking highways, you have disillusioned students striking in the streets, and a general public that is exhausted by simply trying to afford groceries. That kind of widespread institutional distrust doesn't just evaporate.
No, it moves.
Right, it moves from the streets straight to the ballot box.
Yeah.
We are watching the rapid mainstreaming of a massive nationalist shift across the continent. Now, before we get into these numbers, I want to be very clear with our listeners. Our job today isn't to judge whether this political movement is good or bad. We are strictly neutrally reporting the polling data from our sources without taking any political sides.
Exactly. We are just looking at the mechanics of why these voters are moving and how it's redrawing the political map.
Right, so looking objectively at the electoral realities mapped by the European conservative, the right-wing AfD party is surging across Germany. They are positioned to potentially form their first ever government in eastern states.
Yeah, they're pulling in around 40% of the vote in Saxony-Anhalt and 38% in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern.
And historically, the political establishment maintained this thing called a cordon sanitaire, a strict, unified refusal by all mainstream parties to work with nationalist factions.
A firewall, basically.
Right, a firewall designed to keep them out of power. But that firewall is losing its effectiveness. These parties are simply gaining too much of the vote share to be ignored if a region wants to actually form a functioning government.
And the Political Ecology Network analysis breaks down exactly how they are building these massive coalitions. As of 2026, nationalist parties are now sitting in 8 different EU coalition governments.
8. Wow.
Yeah, 8. And they are achieving this by capturing voters at the intersection of 2 very different forces: economic anxiety and cultural concerns surrounding immigration.
The analysis shows how this functions on an individual level, too. A manufacturing worker facing factory closures might vote for a nationalist party seeking protectionist trade policies. But meanwhile, a middle-class professional whose job is perfectly safe might vote for the exact same party because they are concerned about the rate of immigration in their city.
Right. Anti-establishment rhetoric is a highly effective unifier. It bridges class divides by offering a single target for everyone who feels the current state bureaucracy is failing them.
And the silent engine driving a lot of this unification is the algorithm.
Oh, absolutely. Social media.
Yeah. Social media platforms aren't designed to deliberately radicalize voters.
Mhm.
They are designed as engagement machines. I always look at it like a broken thermostat in a house that only responds to fire. If you want the system to notice you, you have to burn something down.
That's a great analogy. The mechanism of engagement heavily rewards emotional intensity, a nuanced, moderate argument about the inefficiencies of EU agricultural bureaucracy. That does not trigger likes or shares.
Not at all.
But if that exact same issue is framed as a deliberate, terrifying threat to a citizen's way of life or their demographic survival, engagement metrics just explode.
Right.
So over time, as voters scroll their feeds searching for information on why their grocery bills are so high, the algorithm feeds them progressively more intense, emotionally charged variations of arguments they initially found reasonable.
So a voter starts out trying to understand local housing subsidies and slowly gets funneled into a worldview where the state is actively working against them. And because this mechanism is producing massive electoral gains for nationalist parties, the traditional mainstream parties are panicking.
To survive, center-right factions are currently adopting hardline anti-immigration platforms and anti-regulatory stances that they would have completely rejected just 10 years ago.
The entire center of political gravity is shifting. Voters who feel culturally threatened are standing shoulder to shoulder with voters who feel economically crushed by the taxes, the rent controls, and the energy policies we unpacked earlier. They are utilizing these anti-establishment platforms as a vehicle for a massive protest vote.
Yeah, against the incumbent collapse.
Let's pull all these threads together for everyone. We started by looking at the sheer polling collapse of incumbent governments in the UK and France, where trust in the state has essentially evaporated. We traced that collapse to the hidden regulatory mechanics, the production taxes that suppress wages, the rent controls that freeze housing supply, and the energy policies that mandate higher costs.
Right, the hidden costs of the state.
Exactly. And we watched that economic pressure boil over into physical protests, with farmers squeezed by environmental rules and students rejecting massive military spending while their daily lives get harder. Finally, we saw how that universal disillusionment is culminating in a massive electoral shift toward nationalist movements.
And, the mechanics of these policies, they aren't just abstract political science theories.
Yeah.
They dictate the exact price you pay at the register for your groceries. They determine whether a developer decides to build an apartment building in your city or take their money elsewhere. When the regulatory burden becomes too heavy, institutional trust collapses, and the political ground shifts completely.
Which leaves us with one final structural question to consider. As these anti-establishment nationalist parties successfully break the cordon sanitaire, enter government coalitions, and essentially become the new establishment themselves, they inherit the exact same economy. Right. Will they run into the exact same structural constraints? I mean, if they find they cannot magically erase the price of global energy or instantly rewrite the rules blocking housing construction, will they eventually face the exact same brutal collapse in voter approval? Something for you to ponder. Keep questioning what you read, and we'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.